sandbox with everybody else. But anyway, it's 7 o'clock. Good evening. I'm not too loud, am I? Okay, very good. So welcome. We are coming to the end of month one of our summer series, a scriptural view of, fill in the blank. Tonight's blank is self. So we will endeavor to discuss what that means over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. Steve is holding blank copies of questions if anyone needs a copy. For next time, for Sunday. Okay. Okay. If you so desire. I just saw blanks and thought they were for tonight. By the way, Keith will be on deck for the next two sessions, so get ready. So again, welcome to everyone, especially our visitors and those of you in virtual land. There may be more of you than there are folks here this evening. So again, over the next 50 minutes, we will endeavor to discuss and talk about the scriptural view of self. So as we're getting into this, I'd like to read 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, I intend always to remind you of these qualities, though you know them and are established in the truth that you have. I think it right, as long as I'm in this body, to stir you up by way of reminder. So I think that is the general intent of this series of lessons. You're not going to hear anything earth-shattering, anything new, but by way of reminder to call to memory things that we need to know. So as I said, I think that's the intent of this particular session. To remind us how we're to conduct ourselves with respect to ourselves and our attitudes and our opinions of self, our views and perspectives of self, and how those views either hinder or enhance our relationship with others and with God. So actually, I don't have the clicker. I should get that. So as Steve shared my notes with everyone, if you didn't notice. How many people have a copy of my notes tonight? There we go. But anyway, not 100. There we go. But you can if you want to. Just slightly. Yeah, just a bit. You were supposed to just have the questions, and I think Steve's impression was that the second set was just scripture. But anyway. Oh, okay. 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 I see. Oh, okay. I see. Yeah. Well, anyway, I responded by plagiarizing your PowerPoint background, so you may recognize that. But anyway, since this the topic or the title of these sessions is a scriptural view of, I thought it would be fitting to begin this session with scripture, passages that speak to the topic of self. So we'll begin by reading a few of these. And again, these are the ones that I thought of immediately when I selected this as the topic that I would facilitate. So we'll begin with Luke chapter 9, beginning verse 23. And it's Jesus talking, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? Move on to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So two passages that speak to the topic of how we are to have a perspective of self. I'll read on a little bit further and then we'll come back and talk about these a bit. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, so forth and so on. And at the very end, avoid such people. not to minimize those other things, reckless lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God and so forth. But within the context of this conversation, lovers of self is the piece that we would focus on. And then finally, Romans chapter 12, beginning verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So those are the top four, my top four. Did any of you have others that stuck out to you as speaking to how we are to perceive self? I've got more, but I thought you might have some as well. Anybody? You want to say something, Larry? I can see it. Okay. I did. Also, so that was question one, by the way, list passages. Go ahead, Steve. Right. Love God. Yep. Love your neighbor. Mhm. Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Good observations. Because no one ever hated himself. I think it was another point that was made there as well. Any others? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So to dislike self would be in either directly or indirectly dislike God. So good observation. Others? A few, yeah, go ahead, Ron. I didn't, but I think it's on my second list. Right. Yeah. That was on my copy of the notes that you didn't get. I have the master copy here. But yeah, putting off the old self, putting on the new self, uh, the way that Paul is describing the way that we view old David versus new David within the context of relationship with God. Also, I put Matthew 23:25. Basically, I did a search for the word self. And I didn't put every instance or copy every instance where the word self showed up. But in Matthew 23:25, Jesus is getting onto the scribes and Pharisees about their hypocrisy, and he accuses them of being full of greed and self-indulgence. So self-indulgence would be a problem. Certainly. Acts 24, verse 25, he reasoned about righteousness and self-control, speaking of Paul and Felix. And Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." So Paul's message to Felix was dealing with the subject of self-control. So one of those self words. We'll talk about those self-words more in a few minutes. Romans 2:8, but to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. Romans 6:6, we know that our old self was crucified with him. 2 Corinthians 4:16, so we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Brian pointed out Ephesians chapter 4:22, putting off the old self, putting on the new self. Philippians 2:3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. Colossians chapter 3, again, put off the old self and put on the new self. And then finally, James chapter 3, verse 16, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. And that's just a small sample of the instances from cover to cover in the Bible where the word self appears. But I think it gives us a pretty broad picture of what the subject of self means when we are talking about our relationship with each other and our relationship with God. So some perspectives. What do we do with self based upon the scriptures that we just read? According to Christ, we deny self. That's one thing. We present ourselves a living sacrifice. We transform ourselves. We put off the old self and put on the new self, and we renew the inner self. So all of those things that we are to do, actively pursue as part of our life or journey as a Christian. How about the not side? What are we to not do with self? That was the very first thing that came to my mind when I picked this subject. So yeah, absolutely. Don't think of oneself more highly than you ought to think. Right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, so don't think of yourself. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. Don't be lovers of self. What are you supposed to do to people who are lovers of self? It said, avoid such people. And do nothing out of selfish ambition. So, and again, that's just a snippet of the things that we are to do with self and to not do with self. All right, any other thoughts on scriptures, passages that deal with the subject of self? So along with passages that speak to the message of self, Gesundheit, the next thing that I thought of was, are there other ways that we think of self? And there was at least one song that we sing. It's number 431, I think, in our Hymns for Worship book, None of Self and All of Thee. So we'll wax poetic for just a moment and read the song, not the whole song, but first verse, oh, the bitter pain and sorrow that a time could ever be when I proudly said to Jesus, all of self and none of thee. Yet he found me, I beheld him, bleeding on the accursed tree, and my wistful heart said faintly, some of self and some of thee. Day by day his tender mercy, healing, helping, full and free, brought me lower while I whispered, less of self and more of thee. Higher than the highest heavens, deeper than the deepest sea, Lord, thy love at last has conquered none of self and all of thee. So that gives a good picture of the journey of a person who starts out with a selfish opinion, selfish motivation, but then as they grow and mature in their journey, then their life, their perspective of self becomes less of self, more of thee, finally none of self and all of thee. So as we get deeper into the discussion tonight, we will discuss some Bible characters, and maybe we think about where did that Bible character land? On verse 2, verse 3, or did they make it all the way to verse 4? And then maybe to yourself, think about your own relationship with God, and where are you? Or have you made it to verse 4? Or are you kind of stuck somewhere, verse 2 or 3? All right. So now we'll move on to discuss the problem of self. So what are some problems when it comes to the topic of self? Okay. Yeah. 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 So we allow ourselves to become consumed with or absorbed in self. Some more than others, but certainly at times, I certainly find myself being consumed with my own things, my own stuff, being absorbed with self, being overly concerned with self-image and self-improvement, too much emphasis on those things. And, I'd heard somebody mention at one point, if everybody woke up tomorrow with an improved self-image, there are a lot of businesses that would go out of business because that's where they make their money. But we do spend a lot of resource, time, effort, money on those type of things, self-improvement, self-image. Not necessarily a bad thing. I want to improve myself. Less hair, gut, more hair, things like that. Won't get there most likely, but certainly if we allow ourselves to become overly concerned, put too much emphasis on those things, then they do become a problem. So also, from the beginning, the chief cause of sin has been self. You go back to the garden. We'll talk about that in a minute. But from the garden till 5 minutes ago, self and selfishness have been a detriment to humankind. So question 2, looking at James chapter 1, beginning verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I think I've got the verse up here, when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. So the question is, how does that passage address the problem of self? What are some thoughts? Yeah. It's all about me, and that's what I highlighted. People are enticed by their own desire. They're lured and enticed by their own desire. And then what does that desire lead to? It leads to eventually death. So when it comes to sin, this is a question on the board, not on your questions, but when it comes to sin, who is our biggest enemy? We are. It's easy to point to Satan and say, well, Satan's our biggest enemy, but if you really think about it, first we should look in the mirror. Satan only lays the path before us. It's left to self to pursue the path. All right, so move on from the problem of sin to undue emphasis on sin. So this you can't see, and I don't know why I went to the trouble, but I discovered that there are over 400 words in the English language that begin with self, whatever. Keep going. There's 420 of them up there, so we're not going to go through all of those. But anyway, just to give you a sense of, over time, the English language has evolved to include over 400 words that have the prefix of self. So we obviously think a lot about ourselves. So there's some words in the English language that have self as the root that describe undesirable attributes, and we'll examine a few. Go right ahead. Right. Yeah. Right. She smells good. Mhm. Right. Right. Mhm. Right. Mhm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Got stuck in the cocoon of selfishness and never metamorphosed, if that's the right word, out of it. Is that where you were going with that? Maybe not that exact analogy. Mhm. It is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Dallas. Yeah. Love. Right. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Right. And I think putting those two ideas together, maturing out of the selfish self that we know and love uh, from from the very first thoughts we've ever had to maturing to that selfless person who is more in tune with 1 Corinthians 13 and other passages that describe selflessness or examples of selflessness. Go ahead, Keith. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Good observation. And we'll talk about some of those Bible characters that on both sides of the spectrum, some that demonstrated extreme selfishness, and on the other end, those who were selfless almost to the extreme as well. So, looking at just a very small snippet of those self prefix words, selfish is the one that's going to get a lot of attention. So, selfish, person, action, or motive lacking consideration for others, concerned chiefly with one's own personal profit and pleasure. So as you think about selfishness in your own experiences, people you know, or people that you read about in the Bible, and you think about what was their motivation for their self-consumption, and it usually goes back to personal profit or personal pleasure of some kind. So the word selfish is, again, the first one that I think of or I thought of when I saw the topic of undue emphasis on self. Self-centeredness, again, similar person who is absorbed with self. Their central focus is self. They are a self-centric person. Self-willed, and I wish I had put down verses where some of these words are found, but self-willed, stubbornly cling to one's own will rather than submitting to the will of God. And you think about Pharaoh, maybe as a potential self-willed person. He was never going to bend to the will of God. He was going to go his own path, even to the detriment of his own people. Self-indulgent, giving free course to one's own passions. We read about self-indulgent, one of the previous passages. Self-righteous, being righteous in one's own eyes. Who do you immediately think of? Pharisees, exactly. Self-reliant, to be reliant on one's own powers and resources rather than relying on God. And for 21st century people, selfie. I just had to throw that one in there. I don't know that there's anything wrong with selfies, but to constantly be photographing oneself may become a problem if you do it too much. So third question, list and define words that contain self as a prefix which describe undesirable attributes. Do you have any to add to that list? Again, that's my list. You may have your own if you thought of other words that fit within that category. Well, yeah, there were. Not all of them were bad, though. Just some of them. Somebody said something. Self-seeking. And how do you think of any particular character or circumstance for self-seeking, or is it just one that pops to mind? Yeah, but no, it's a good one. Okay, you don't. That's another story that we'll talk about later. But yeah, I'm sure that was on the list of 400. Any other words? Okay, good. I think this is a pretty good list to work from. But anyway, so selfishness. We'll focus on that for just a minute. In what ways does selfishness manifest itself? I guess I can click down. Don't put your hand up. Don't read. I should have put some animation in there. But so let's take the first one. In matters of our personal interest, how does selfishness manifest itself? In what ways can selfishness manifest itself when it comes to my interest versus the interest of you or the greater audience? Yeah, it's what I need. I see that you need something, but obviously my need is greater than yours, so I've got to attend to my need, right? And yeah, what do we base those decisions on? Yeah. What do we base those decisions on? Yeah. So we go back to Philippians chapter 2, I think is one of the verses that we read earlier, or I read earlier. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interests of others. So I think that speaks to the comments that have been made already. We get concerned with our own interests more than the interests of others, the point Larry was making. We consider our affairs to be more important than someone else's affairs. If you think of individual examples of how a person may exhibit a selfish attitude, sometimes people, they got to dominate the conversation. Their words are more important than yours. What they need to say is more important than what you need to say. So, and you can think of people maybe in your own life who do that, or people that you work with, people in school, people somewhere that are like that. You can think of that guy or that gal. How about with our time? How do we, or humanity in general, how do we manifest selfishness with respect to time? Yeah. 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 Exactly. So there's only so much time that we have. We've got a bucket of time that God has blessed us with, and that's all we're going to get. Uh, we can get more money, we can get more stuff, more houses if we're that wealthy. We can't buy more time. Um, so there's a fixed amount of it. So it makes it a prime candidate for selfishness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, loses his own soul? Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. How can you bear someone else's burdens if all of your time is consumed on yourself? Yeah, that's the point there. If we bear one another's burdens, we have to go beyond our comfort zone right here. Uh, yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. So that is that struggle between selfish me and selfless me. Do you have a point, Steve? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. What did you do with all the time? Yeah. 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 Your own stuff. Yeah. There's there's an accounting of time that we're going to have to be aware of for certain. Matters of money. How does selfishness manifest itself when it comes to the almighty dollar? It's mine. Yep, exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a reminder for ourselves every Sunday when a collection is taken. It's not our money. The verse that we read earlier, Matthew 23:25, where Jesus is pronouncing the woes upon the scribes and Pharisees, uh, he points out their greed and self-indulgence. So take it even a step further. Underlying sin or motive for someone who is selfish with money could include things such as a lack of trust in God. If you're putting all of your trust in your bank account or your 401k or whatever, then maybe you're saying, I don't trust Him enough to provide for my needs. So I've got to hoard hoard more and more money. Maybe a lack of joy in God. People may seek happiness in things that money can buy rather than the relationship with God. So if we're spending all of our time accumulating money and saving money and then spending money, maybe the happiness is misguided. It's in the wrong area. And then finally, lack of finding status in Christ. Maybe the status that we're looking for goes with our bank account once again. Instead of seeking status that money affords us, maybe we should find greater significance in what our status with Christ is. And then finally, consideration of others. How does selfishness manifest itself there? I think we've already discussed that some, but does anybody else have another point about how a selfish attitude manifests itself with respect to our relationship with other people? But, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's allocated out. Yeah. 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 That's almost. I think that's a pretty good segue. Unless somebody else has another comment on any of the manifestations of how selfishness produces itself. Go ahead, Ron. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So that's an exhibition of selflessness more so than selfish. Good points. Good observation. So move into the topic of selfishness again. Biblical examples. Again, this is my list. Uh, you may have your own list. We've got about 9 minutes. So, do any of these stick out to you as questionable, or are there some on the list that you're saying, why did you not, or something not on the list that you said, how did you miss that? Start at the top. We've already talked about Adam and Eve a little bit. Obviously, the episode in the garden where they're tempted by Satan. The tree was good for food. It was delight to the eyes, desired to make one wise. All, in my mind, selfish motivation to pursue the fruit. It doesn't say Adam and Eve were selfish, but to me, in between the lines, it does say that they were. Cain, obviously, am I my brother's keeper? Not my day to watch him. I put pre-flood mankind because what do we learn about pre-flood mankind in Genesis 6:5? Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was on evil continually. I'm taking care of me. I'm not worried about all you other losers. I'm taking care of myself. Lot. What was Lot's problem when it came to selfishness? Chose the best land. What was it near? Near Sodom eventually. So he eventually moves to Sodom. We know the rest of the story. Lot becomes father of Moab and Ammon. Who are they? They're two of the nations that are thorns in the side of Israel for all time. So that one decision created a much larger problem. Nation of Israel, how was the nation of, and that's broad brush, but how was the nation of Israel, and it's not Joshua, it's Judges. I put the whole wrong book up there, sorry. How was the nation of Israel, how did they demonstrate selfishness? In his own eyes, exactly. So kind of the pre-flood mankind mentality, looking out for myself. How about Ahab? How was he selfish? I want a vineyard. He won't let me have it. So he exhibited selfishness. Going back to David, and it was, I enjoyed the Ben Hall series a couple weeks ago, and he alluded to it in the opening comments the first day, that depending on what slice of David's life you're reading about, he could be on either list, selfless or selfish. He's on this one because of the Bathsheba episode. Mm-hmm. True. Yeah. Yeah, Absalom, yeah. He could be a subheading under David, definitely. As well as could Amnon, yeah. He's got too many sons. I couldn't get the right son. I put rich young ruler. And again, that's reading between the lines, but something that Steve was saying on one of his last comments, that when you are rich, you're young, and you're in a position of authority, and Christ tells you, give it all up and follow me, that's not an easy message to hear. So was there a measure of selfishness on his part that he went away sad? So that's why I put that listing there, because if not for a selfish attitude about his possessions, and his position of authority, then perhaps he could have let go. Perhaps he could have been a follower. Hopefully he eventually changed his mind. We don't know that. And then finally, Ananias and Sapphira. What was their problem? They did. Yeah, so you go back to that definition of selfishness that I read earlier. I've completely lost it. Here it is. Lacking consideration for others, but concerned chiefly with one's own personal profit and pleasure. So you think about all of those examples, everybody was more concerned in some way or another with their own personal pleasure or personal profit more so than their relationship with God. It served as a barrier that they were somehow unwilling to go over or around to improve and enhance their relationship with God. So who else belongs on the list that you can think of? New Testament, Old Testament? Yeah. Yeah. He could have it. So personal profit on the part of Judas. So he's a good one to add to the list. Who else? Saul. Yes. In what way or ways? Yeah. 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 He thought he did, but he didn't. Yeah. Yeah. So good thoughts. Anybody else? Yes. Is it Aaron's son or Eli's son? Yeah. Some priest somewhere. Yeah. Personal profit or pleasure, both in that case. All right, good stuff. So I think that was the first bell, so we've got a couple of minutes left. So now on the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of biblical examples. I think it's question 6. People who exhibited selflessness, obviously Christ, top of the list, no question, 100% selfless. I put Abraham, the opposite of Saul, but you can look from a number of perspectives on Abraham. But go back to the Lot episode. He was the one who gave Lot the option of which land. He was selfless in his dealing with Lot. He did, exactly. He also said, leave your home, leave everything you're familiar with, go to a land that I'll show you. And he uproots and goes. So a number of instances with Abraham. Joseph, Old Testament Joseph. And he's an interesting one to me because he's in a gigantic position of authority in Egypt, I think second in command. And he sees his brothers. And what would be your first thought that comes into your mind? You've seen these guys. The last time I saw you bunch, I was bound hand and foot headed south, and you were doing nothing about it. So turnabout's fair play, guys. Maybe he thought of that because he did make them sweat a little bit, But in the end, he said, no time for revenge. You're my family. Go get my father. Go get your families. Come to Egypt. So he provided for his family. Good Samaritan. Parable, but could potentially have been a real story that Jesus was relating to the people. But obviously an individual who made provision for a stranger. It's easy for us to think about providing for family, friend, neighbor, but a complete stranger that's laying in a ditch, that is a very clear picture of selflessness. Barnabas, Acts chapter 4, the opposite of Ananias and Sapphira in this example. He sold land and gave the entire sack of money to the apostles. And then finally, Paul. You can talk about a number of instances with Paul, but in this particular one, he's referring to himself as having been crucified with Christ. And then we can see for his life from road of Damascus on was a life of selflessness. So from Galatians chapter 2, the verse that's there, Paul said that he was no longer living, but that Christ was living in him. Means that he was selflessly given, or had selflessly given control of his life over to Christ and become obedient to Jesus. So we must do the same thing, put self to death, and that's accomplished by the final question. Christians must learn to observe self-denial, self-control, and self-sacrifice. Did you have one more thought? Okay. You're scratching an ear or something, I guess. So I believe that brings us to 7:50. I appreciate the observations, participation, good comments. Again, I don't think we learned anything new but at least it called to memory things that we need to be aware of in our dealings, our conduct, our behavior when it comes to relationships with each other, relationships with family, but more important, relationships with God. So stay tuned Sunday. Mr. Maddox will be presenting lesson, scriptural view of Others. That's a movie. And then The Lost, which is a television series, is coming out next Wednesday. Thanks a lot, folks.